live because it takes a minute. Okay, so we're live. So we're ready to go. All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're here with another of our virtual events this afternoon. And today we have our good friend, Rhys Bowen. She's going to be discussing her brand new book, Where the Sky Begins. And Rhys has signed a whole batch of books for us. Find the title page. Here we go. And I'll go ahead and put a link to on the comments field in YouTube and Facebook if you'd like to purchase one. If you have questions for Rhys, go ahead and put them in. And Barbara usually summons us back on screen at about quarter till. I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I should mention that we have a hardcover edition, but we also have a paperback edition. And Rhys has kindly signed both of them. And we're rapidly running out of the hardcover edition, and at some point we can reorder the paperback without Rhys signing it, but she'll be here in November. And I think we are launching her new Lady Georgie book on November 1st, right?
That's true. Yeah. Peril in Paris. And have you noticed how many Peril books there are this year coming out? Everybody's calling it Peril for some reason.
You know, I have, Rhys. The other thing we've noticed is there are lots of locked room mysteries. There are lots of variations on Agatha Christie's, and then there were none. And there is a movement towards witches and the supernatural and even horror. And I have to think about whether this is in part pandemic inspired and whether in part is just the normal cycles of publishing.
Who knows?
Who knows indeed. However, you'll be pleased to know that Where the Sky Begins isn't falling into any of those. This is a wonderful, basically, I don't want to call it an old-fashioned storytelling, but it's certainly solidly, what would you say, Rhys, kind of almost golden age, even though there's a lot of contemporary issues in it?
I suppose so. I mean, it's all, I mean, it's not like some of my others where we've leapt between time periods and things. It's just one woman's evolving story, I suppose. What I wanted to write was a story that literally was a rebirth. You know, it's a woman who's pulled from the rubble of her house with nothing. And I found myself thinking, what would you do if you had nothing? Everything you had been destroyed and you didn't have a loving family to say, come and live with us. There were so many of them in the war. What happened to them? So that was what I was curious about to start with is, you know, how do you find a new life for yourself, especially when your old life has been so restricted? How do you get on your feet again? So this is a story of a woman who not only reinvents herself, but really comes through triumphant at the end after. I wanted to show too that her life, as it was for many people in the war, was one step forward and then two steps back. Just when you think you're safe, you're not. Just when you think you've got a way ahead, you haven't. So it required an incredible amount of resiliency in those days, I think.
You know, it did. But one of the things I particularly liked was that despite the one step forward, two step back, which was true for so many people, there was a real sense of community and pulling together and, quote, doing our bit that, you know, that kept everybody going. And it helped, if not heal, at least smooth over the fractures that because people were in such stressful positions, there was, you know, they were bound to be cranky or whatever, you know, but it did sort of help forge them into a group.
I think that's so true. And I've just done a couple of articles recently on why World War II is so popular. And I think one of the things I said was it was the last occasion when we had a clear sense of good versus evil. And everybody felt if we didn't all come together to stop evil, it would swallow the world. And I don't think we've had that feeling since then. And so in those days, everybody was prepared to do, well, there were a few people who made out with black market and things, but nearly everybody was prepared to do their bit, as they said. You know, they were prepared to go and enlist for one of the services. They were prepared to work in factories. You know, you had women in factories making bombs, standing 12 hours a day making bombs. So everybody was prepared to do what it took. And I think there was this incredible sense of community that we all have to help each other. And if one has a little less, you share and you give out to everybody. And I think that's what my heroine Josie likes about when she moves to this village is that everybody is there for her. Really, they adopt her as one of their own, and she feels cared for. I think that's a very nice feeling for her.
It is a nice feeling for her. I mean, she's a young woman who didn't have a lot going for her. She made a marriage that was kind of like, the first guy that came along. And there's not a lot of love or not a lot of certainly romance in her marriage, but he is off somewhere fighting when the bomb falls and destroys Josie's house and her whole way of life in London. So that adds a complication to the story. If she were single, it would be a different story, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. Well, I mean, and the fact is that she's, in a way, she's relieved that he's gone and he's off fighting because, well, for the first time, when he goes, the first time she can get a job, he hasn't wanted her to work before. He sees it as an insult to his manhood that he can't provide for his wife. And also he expects that they should have children by now, which of course they haven't. And he completely blames her for, which obviously we know these days might not have been her fault at all, but whatever happens, they haven't had children. And so what she liked about him to start with, which was that cocky self-assurance, has now turned to bullying. And I think she's very relieved when he's sent off somewhere into the wide blue yonder and she has no idea where he is. But then that hangs over her is that my husband is still alive somewhere. And it means you can't really move on with your life because he is somewhere and he may well reappear, which we know he does.
Well, that's definitely true. But at the same time, don't you think it was easier for her in the village near Peterborough, which is north, easier for her to be accepted as a married woman rather than, because I think single women coming into households and so forth were regarded with more suspicion, or there was kind of an idea they were fast or maybe actually, actually hookers or whatever so I do think the fact that she was married made her respectable.
I think that's true, yeah. And also, I mean, coming from London, people in a village would have thought, that woman with her fast and loose ways otherwise, whereas, they're sorry for her, then they can identify her husband's off somewhere and she doesn't know where, just like all their husbands. And as we find out in the book, some of them have already lost sons. It's the beginning of the war and they've already lost someone at Dunkirk or they've always lost someone on a ship. It's one thing I wanted to show was that she's evacuated from London because she's quite badly injured and there's nowhere for her to go in London. And you'd think sending her out into this beautiful countryside, she'd be safe. And the first thing she finds, of course, is that she's not safe at all. The house they've sent her to, this very nice Georgian house in its grounds, is right next to a bomber base. And every night the planes take off for Germany and every morning only half of them come back. So she's very aware that the war is right there beside her.
Well, that's certainly true. And of course, she doesn't get a warm welcome from the woman who owns the house. She's there she's sent there with a number of children, and the children are accepted into the community. Although I think, I'm trying to remember, I think it's in your book. Isn't there one or two that sort of think the children are going to be unpaid servants if they're going to be billeted on them for the war?
That wasn't this book, but I've read about it it was definitely true of some children who were evacuated. And, I've read the true stories, had a wonderful time and had good food for the first time. And others, especially farming children, the farmer saw them as an unpaid hand to work in the fields. And so it was very much a roll of the dice, whether you've got, and of course, the children in my book get this lovely older couple who really give them what they haven't had before. They give them the love of a parent, which two of these children have been lacking until now.
Oh, absolutely. They go to a very nurturing environment.
Yeah.
And Josie is sent, I think that the woman and the woman's servant, because she has an Irish servant. It's the last of what was a larger household staff, and it's certainly true that it did take a staff to maintain a big house and a big, the garden is so important in your story. Yeah. And if it's down to, two aging women, it's really almost impossible. One of the things that you make it, you describe so well in this book was how difficult it was just to be fed well. You really had to have, like, we called them victory gardens in this country, but really to eat, you had to grow your own food. There was rationing. You were better off in the country, God knows, than you were, where food had to be delivered to you.
Yeah, you were certainly better off in the country because you could at least grow vegetables. In the city, there were times when to see an onion would be such a treat. You've got an onion in today. And the other thing in the city too is you might have the coupons on your ration book, but you could stand there in a store and you can look and you'd say, oh, you don't have any sugar today, you don't have any tea today, you don't have it, because the supplies had not come in. Anything that had to come in from somewhere else, could be held up. And I have ration cards, over the years I've collected these things, ration cards from World War II, and you were allowed 1/4 of a pound of meat per week per person. Now that worked out okay. If you had a big household, if you had 5 children, you'd get enough to get like a decent roast once a week, maybe, if you could get the roast, and then you could have it curried one day, in a pie one day, you could stretch it out. But if you were just one person and you got your 1/4 of a pound of meat, what on earth would you do with it? That'd be one small lamb chop, really. And that was it. So I've got a book of World War II recipes, and they mostly sound quite disgusting to me. There's one, that's like turnip and potato pie, and all that sort of things. Anything to just eke out the vegetables with a little bit of broth or something. And I expect things like bovril went down very well because you could make a gravy with it to have over those vegetables. But no, it would have been very hard. And of course, eggs. If you were in the country, you could have eggs, and in the city, the only thing you could get would be the powdered egg, which tasted not at all like eggs, I gather. And I know my grandmother, who was a very respectable woman, she would go out with her basket to meet the egg woman, and money and eggs would change hands as they walked down the street, and she'd come back with a couple of eggs. That's how it worked.
Right. Well, yeah, you could certainly see that if you could keep chickens, if, there was a butcher that, had access to local animals, if you could grow stuff in your garden, it would all be great. But, there's such a modern parallel to the first stages of the pandemic. I mean, toilet paper was not nearly as essential to life as, let's say, eggs. But we all found out that the longer the supply line stretches, the more fragile it is if anything breaks it. And, that leaves you, because you're no longer growing your own food or, hauling your own water or whatever, that leaves people, especially in crowds of people, really vulnerable.
Well, just think in World War II, how much food came into England from the rest of the Commonwealth normally. I mean, you had all of the lamb coming in from Australia, you had the beef coming in from Argentina, you had all the things like oranges, bananas and things, which don't grow in England, just didn't exist anymore. And so, as a small child, I heard people, I was born in the middle of the war. I heard people talking about bananas. Oh, don't you miss bananas? Oh, yes. And I'm dying to know what a banana tastes like. And after the war, bananas came in and someone gave me one. And I went, this is what they've been waiting for. This is horrible. I still don't like bananas very much, but it was a huge disappointment in my life.
So Josie, in an attempt to gain a little independence from Stan, had been involved with the tea room in London. There was an elegant Russian immigrant who maintained a tea room, and Josie had worked with her. And so really, she doesn't have a lot of skills to transfer to the village, but she was used to baking and maintaining the tea room, but she has to grow. But Miss Harcourt, why is she, well, we don't want to spoil the book. All right, Miss Harcourt is really offended and reluctant to have Josie billeted on her at all.
Yes.
But she kind of keeps her distance for a long time in the book. But the person that Josie spends more time with is Miss Harcourt's servant. And you made her Irish, which I think is fascinating. So why'd you do that?
Well, I think it was true. There were many, many Irish servants, because in Ireland, there was very little you could do. And, the very, apart from Dublin, there are very few jobs. And so the Irish coming across to be servants in England was a very well-established tradition. A lot of families would have an Irish servant. And of course, in the case of someone like Kathleen, she's not educated in any way. She probably can just about read and write. But the sad thing is, I think, for her, that she, when the old master was there before, she really didn't have the time off. She wasn't ever allowed the time off to go and see her family. And now her family is really pretty much all gone, at least, her parents and things. And so she's stuck in a country that's not her own, and with a lot of resentment, obviously, that she is a servant. And it's this sort of love-hate relationship with Miss Harcourt. She hates really being in someone else's country and being a servant, but she and Miss Harcourt have grown to need each other, I think. And of course, she resents Josie arriving, even though Josie is very willing to work and is going to take some of the workload off her. But so we have this, it shows Kathleen, she fluctuates between, well, I'm glad you're here and that's something nice you've baked, to why are you here and when are you leaving? And so poor Josie doesn't know where she stands with Kathleen. She tries to be nice, she tries to be helpful, and Kathleen would clearly welcome some company. But then she pushes Josie away again and finds every opportunity to criticize. Why are you doing that? And then, of course, when the mistress finally starts to show interest in Josie and actually likes Josie, then, of course, the jealousy rears up, because Miss Harcourt is all Kathleen has.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Kathleen worried. Yeah, you're right. It is jealousy. But also at the beginning, it means that Josie is nervous about whether she'll actually get to stay with Miss Harcourt, since neither she nor Kathleen really want Josie there. And so the tea room comes into play, doesn't it, as a way for Josie to find her place there in the village. So you must have had fun with that.
I did. My first working title for this book was The Tea Shop at the Edge of Eternity, which I really liked, and got shot down by the marketing people who said, A, it was too many words to read on a cover, and B, men would not be attracted by the word tea shop, and C, people would think it was like the restaurant at the edge of the universe sort of thing. And but it said a lot to me that there was this little spot of civilization right next to where the runway of the bomber base is. And of course, what happens is Josie sees this young man leaning against her wall, and his bike's got a flat tire and it's pouring with rain. And she invites him in for a cup of tea, and he sits there and he looks around the room and he says, this is just like home. And she suddenly realizes that a lot of these are 18 when they're taken in to train to be pilots. So they're 18 and they're flying into Germany and dropping bombs and being shot at and bringing the plane back with one wind, so they do this all the time. What they want is not the pub to get drunk. They want that tiny slice of home. And so she has to persuade Miss Harcourt, not very easily, of course, that there are all these rooms in the house that are shut up and not used. How about if we just open one of them and she'd provide tea and a slice of home for a few seconds? And that's what she does. Of course, I think the first time we come really to appreciate Josie and what she's going to be is when Miss Harcourt says to her, and when you've recovered from your injuries, we'll have to decide what your duties are. Yes. And Josie says to her, I don't mind helping out, but I ain't no servant. You're not going to walk all over me, which I really liked. Then she stands up. From then on, she gradually gets this feeling of self-worth that her husband Stan has really stomped out of her all this time.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it is interesting how well she did stand up for herself to both Kathleen and Miss Harcourt and other characters. I mean, because there are other characters in the village. There's a doctor who is interesting. And then inevitably there is an attractive airman, and he's Canadian. Yes. And, I thought, I really like the fact that you reminded us that there were lots of men all across the Commonwealth who came to England to fight. To fly or whatever. And there were a lot of wasn't there an entire Canadian?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Regiment? I know there was a group of Canadian women who went to support the aerial fight. I mean, they were I can't remember what they were called, but somebody wrote a book about this group of Canadian women who went to support the aviation, the men in
There
the
was,
war.
there was in fact a complete, as you say, Canadian regiment later, but this, we're fairly near the beginning of the war here still,
Right.
and so these people have come over on their own, and that's always impressed me, that someone would come from somewhere like Australia or Canada where you're completely safe, and no one says you have to join up at this stage, and yet they think this is the mother country, I need to do this. So they come and do it. And of course, as we find out with Mike, the pilot, he has several reasons for wanting to come over and do it.
Well, he does. And, it's interesting that while, that idea of the Commonwealth growing out of the British Empire brought all those people over, ironically, the war is the thing that gradually put an end, to the Commonwealth, even though they're sort of nominal members of it today. So, the 20th century, those two wars, even though England was on the winning side, basically brought it into, to the British Empire. And really changed life. I've often wondered, what your opinion is, because after all, you are British. Do you think, how much do you think that Churchill's rhetoric held people together in those darkest hours around Dunkirk and all, when it might have been easier just to give up?
Yeah, I think he was solely responsible for winning the war, actually. I think he was the sort of person in peacetime, he was the most obnoxiously overbearing person, and you certainly wouldn't have wanted to know him or have him to dinner or anything. But because of this incredible ego, I suppose, and belief in himself, etc., I mean, he was able to deliver these amazing speeches, and everybody would look up from where they were toiling and go, yeah, he's right, we can do this. And so his rhetoric was overwhelming, wasn't it, really, when you see what he said? And there was obviously, I wrote a book called In Farley Field, which at that time everybody is sure the invasion is imminent, and if it had happened, I think at that time Britain could not have repelled it. We would have been invaded. Luckily, Hitler was never very stable mentally and suddenly decided to turn on Russia instead, and that was a reprieve. And during that time, Britain got more weapons, got more training, and the Americans came in. So all those things came in to make sure that things were on a more even footing, I think. But no, at the beginning of the war, my father was one of those classic examples. He was in a protected occupation. He ran a factory, and he thought he should sign up. So he went, and they said, no, you're in a protected occupation. So he said, what do you need? And they said, we need drivers. And he went and filled out another form, and he came back and he said, I'm a driver. So, that was what people did, which looking back now, you think, well, you were so stupid, you should have stayed home and ran your factory. But no, people wanted to do their share. And after the war, we're talking, one of these other, I've done a lot of Zooms this week, talking about after the war and PTSD. And I think most men that I came across were actually proud of what they'd done. In a way, I won't say they'd had a good time, but they'd had this incredible male bonding experience, that they'd all been together. My father was out in Egypt for 3 years, living in a tent in the sand and fighting at El Alamein and things. And he used to go to all the reunions and enjoy meeting all his old comrades. So in a way, there was a pride there that it wasn't like after Vietnam where you think, my God, what did we do? It was like, we helped to win this war. This was great. We drove Rommel out of North Africa. We can be very proud about that. So, again, we get that feeling of everybody doing their part and wanting to get into it together, which I think is very satisfying.
Well, I agree with you. We come back to your earlier point, which is that, Ken Follett said it. I think I told you I went to an international thriller writers conference, and somebody asked Ken Follett why he, wrote so many books about World War II. And he said, or why there were so many. And he said, like you, that, it was the war. It was the war where it was clear, which was the good and which was the evil. And, Vietnam was a terribly divisive war. And so people didn't have that same sense of, working towards a common goal that everybody shared and that everybody was proud of it, and people who fought and the women who worked at Bletchley and did other things, they all kept the Official Secrets Act,
Yeah.
which, you can't even imagine today when everything leaks before you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, obviously I've written a book about Bletchley Park, and the thing that amazed me was that you could not divulge until the mid-90s, 1990s, what you had done during that war. And the sad thing was that so many parents died not knowing that their son or their daughter had done something was actually very heroic, that might have saved more lives than someone who'd been fighting. To that parent, they were just, they were doing that boring little office job, when in fact they were cracking an enigma code, but they couldn't tell anybody. That seems, I don't think you or I would never ever have managed to do that. We would have leaked little bits to our husbands, don't you think?
Well, with social media, I mean, you just have to look at, the terrible things going on with Russia and the Ukraine, but we're all aware of that almost as it happens.
Yeah.
And, even though World War II had good communications, there was not that's spectator sense or immediate feedback. Now, we didn't mention that the book actually it starts in 1940 in London, when Josie's life is blown to bits by Stan's away. So Stan's not blown to bits, but Josie's house and everything is blown to bits. And the woman who owns the tea shop is killed, the tea shop, all the rest of it. But then we go all the way through the war. So it is a linear story, and as you say, differently structured than the earlier books like this that you have written, the standalone, because they have tended to they have gone back and forth in time. But this one is a linear progression designed to show us how Josie begins and how she works through and how she learns to be herself and learns what matters to her and deals with what life hands her. And then we get to the end. And well, we're not going to tell you what the end is, even though this isn't a mystery. Although there's just a hint of a mystery in it, isn't there?
Well, you know me, I can't write a book without some hint of mystery somewhere. It has to come in somewhere. Having written so many mysteries in my life, I find it really hard. I'm writing a book and I think, well, when's the body going to appear? And I wrote, okay, there's not going to be a body in this one. Well, how am I going to handle a story without a body in it? That's very difficult. But no, there is that hint of, mystery or thriller in this, in that there's a traitor in their mix somewhere, and there are secrets which have to come out. So yes, there's that hint of mystery.
I like, Josie's a different character. I mean, many of your characters have been aristocratic. Not all, but certainly Lady Georgie and people that she hangs out with, and some of them in Farleyfield and in some of your other stories. But Josie is really your basic working class London girl, and so I really enjoyed spending time with her. Was it? It must have been a different thing for you to craft her.
It really was. I think as you say, everybody else that I've written is either aristocratic or at least they're educated, and they've come into this story with skills to cope more than she has. If you've traveled, if you've had an education, you know how to find things, you know how to handle various things, you know how to handle transportation, you've just done things. And so when life throws a curve at you, you think, oh, well, yes, I can do that. Where she's really grown up in the narrowest of, that's why I chose the title. She's grown up in this narrow street and everybody has a coal fire. So you have this perpetual haze hanging over you. So when she's taken out to the countryside and she's taken to Lincolnshire, which is the flattest part of England, and it's an area like Holland where they drained the fields a couple of centuries ago to grow crops. So you have this complete and utter flatness, and you have this enormous sky. So for her, she must feel like an ant. If you turn over an anthill and for the first time, just looking up and seeing this vast expanse of sky. And for her, that was overpowering, just that physical looking at that sort of landscape that went on forever and ever. If you go to that part of England, they build their churches with these wonderfully high spires, So you can see the next village from 5 miles away. You know, oh, that's that over there. You can look and point to each village because you can see the spires. So my best friend from college still lives in that area, which is, I suppose, one of the reasons I was attracted to this story to start with the whole, and all the big bomber bases were there because A, it was flat, and B, it was facing Germany. So it was a good place to take off from. And of course, when America came into the war, they built most of the American Air Force bases were on that coast too. So they have fabulous air museums, and my friends took me to various ones of these. So I've been inside a Lancaster bomber, and I've seen the helmets, and I've seen the parachutes, and I've seen all these things that they had, and it really brings it home to you. You know, there were letters from young men to their sweethearts, young men who'd actually crashed with their planes, and the letter was brought later, you know. So it all touches you, the fact that every one of these was someone with people who cared about them.
Well, you know, I thought to myself that it was an interesting place for evacuees to be sent at all because of the significance, the strategic importance, and so forth of the airfields.
Yeah.
So it was inherently unsafe.
Yeah.
In the sense that the Germans would want to go after it. I mean, if you sent them out to the West Country where there wasn't, you know, that the art museum, I'm trying to remember the name of it, you know, whatever it is, the London galleries sent their art treasures, for example, to be buried into the mines in Wales.
In Wales, yes, they did, yeah. And all the original evacuees were sent south and west. You know, the big evacuation would have happened at the end of 39 into 40, when whole classes of school children and their teachers got on a train and went to Cornwall or somewhere. So I think by the time this happens, we're still looking for places to send people. You know, it's not quite as easy to find places.
Although ironically, you know, by sending them south, they were sending them closer to Germany or closer to France. So, you know, maybe they were less industrial and then maybe not perceived so much as bombing targets, but if there had been an invasion, they would have been right in the path of it, as compared to sending them up to like Northumberland, for example, where, you know, it would have been a long way away. Did the Scottish not participate in the evacuation thing? I mean, were children not sent as far as Scotland?
I don't think the children were sent much further than that great, you know, we drew a circle around London. Okay. I don't think they were sent as far as Wales, I know that, but I don't think anybody was sent up, say, you know, to the Lake District or anything. I think they were just too far away. These kids, I suppose, wanted to be within shouting distance of home too. You know, sometimes the mother would come and visit them at weekends and things if their mum was still in London. And I think perhaps parents wouldn't have agreed if you said, I'm sending your child to Scotland. They go, oh, no, you're not. So, you know, it had to be an agreement from the parents that they were going to be evacuated. So
right. Well, no, that's a good point to make, because it wasn't enforced. In the same way that there was, I'm trying to remember what it's called, the children's train, for lack of anything else. There were Jewish families who sent their children
the kinder transport.
The kinder transport out of Germany while they could still do it. Into England. And again, it had to be by consent. I mean, it wasn't like anybody came along and said, we're you know, drafting your children.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of my characters in this, we have the little German girl, Lottie, whose parents have done this for her, who've done this, turns out to be the ultimate sacrifice for her. And she's based on somebody that I knew, who was put with a family in London to start with, and what turned out to be with two elderly sisters who said, oh, good, now we've got a servant. And so this.
That's why I was thinking about that when I mentioned earlier. You're right. It was Lottie who had that experience.
Yeah, and the poor little girl, you know, she's 12 years old, and they say, you know, go to the butcher's, bring us back now, cook us a chicken. And of course, you know, she's actually grown up in an upper class family in Germany herself. She has no idea how to, and they think it's great that she's going to be doing all their work for them from now on. So, you know, sometimes they hit it, they were lucky, they got a really good billet, and other times they didn't.
Very true. But, you know, it was also uncomfortable for her because regardless of how she got there, she was still German. Yes. And therefore, you know, many people really resented her, even though she was a refugee.
Yeah.
the war. And again, there are so many modern parallels to this, the Syrians, the Afghanis, all the people that we've tried, the Ukrainians currently,
Yeah.
that are taken into other countries. And even though, there's a war, I mean, they're refugees,
Yeah.
they're not there as secret agents.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think German people in England suffered an awful lot because they had the German accent and their name was Gottfried or something, so they were regarded with great suspicion that they were probably spies, and some of them were interned, even though they were Jewish and they'd fled because they were Jewish. And so,
well, we did the same thing in the United States. We interned the Japanese on the West Coast,
of course, yeah,
and there was a lot of both Italian and German communities in the Midwest and so forth. There was a lot of suspicion. I think there might have been some actual internment. So
yeah.
Any nation that has accepted other nationalities, when things go sour through a war or something, those people are left in a difficult position. They were outlanders to start with, outsiders to start with, but then it gets more difficult. So I worried about Lottie. I have to say, I was really concerned that somebody was going to harm her because.
Yeah. It's well, I think she was lucky in that the family that she got put with, and also that she had a couple of champions. She had the old man who was the father of this family was clearly would say he'd come to that school and teach them a lesson or two, and then the Jewish German doctor who becomes her protector and her mentor, which is, and we see what he's going through. He's had to give up his position in a distinguished hospital and come out to a little country hospital because everybody the whole time looked at him suspiciously because he had a German accent.
Well, the one final thing I would like to mention, we've talked about the terrible food and, other deprivations, but we also haven't really talked about how rudimentary medical care was for pilots who came back with terrible injuries, who was looking after them. And Josie, I don't want to give away why, but Josie is forced into a nursing position. And, it's really basic, and there's very little that can be really done for people who have, I mean, we're not quite at the Civil War thing where if you had a bullet in the arm or leg, they just took off your limb because otherwise gangrene would almost inevitably set in. But there are a lot of injuries that today could be dealt with better, with triage, and where there was just no way to do it. Even if people knew how, there weren't any medical supplies or facilities. So a lot of people died that, you could say unnecessarily, because of the lack of medical care. How did you research all that? Because you had to be pretty accurate about it.
I am. I've read a lot of first-person accounts more than anything, I think, of people who did the various things in the war. And of course, in this book, the other thing we realize is the complete lack of understanding of mental problems. The fact that some of these young men were under such stress, and if they cracked in any way, you would put LMF next to their name, which is lacking moral fiber, and then they would be demoted in front of everybody. If someone was like in a flight crew and suddenly couldn't fly anymore, they would stand in front of everybody and have their stripes ripped off them. And some of these people committed suicide because of that. No, there was no understanding that to do this every day, especially when you're 18, 19 years old, to do this every day, some people would crack. And in the case in this book, it's someone who's not a pilot, but who has to service these planes, who has the planes coming back with someone who's like vomited or shit all over them, and or people who come back with half their limb blown off, and he can't do that anymore. So it was a complete lack of understanding that not all young men can handle this.
And yet, when you look back at World War I, when there was so much of that, you would think that some of that would have carried over, but apparently not. I mean, I think that trench warfare must have been the most horrific experience.
I think in World War I, what we saw was this complete contrast, because it was so close. You could be back in France in 2 hours. So you'd go home on leave and you'd sit and have strawberries and cream for tea. And then they'd put you on a plane, on a train, and suddenly you're back in a trench with mud up to your knees in mud and rats running around you and shells coming over you. And there were minds that couldn't handle that, and they just snapped. And then, of course, in those days, they called it shell shock, didn't they? But they shot an awful lot of young men for cowardice, because literally their legs wouldn't carry them over the top when they were instructed to go.
Right. And so you would have thought there would have been a little more understanding when we got to the next war, which is just a generation later, tragically, about that. But no. So, yeah. And, you know, Rhys, there was an article, I think it was in today's, it doesn't matter. But anyway, about a very much respected athlete, football player, who was just a star, and inexplicably at one point shot his wife and killed himself, and leaving 4 children. And, you know, it eventually turns out that he did have the chronic, you know, concussion syndrome, whatever it's actually called. But more or less the same thing, that, you know, from the outside, people didn't allow for that. And therefore he committed suicide, but, you know, at least he didn't kill his children. He took his wife with him, but people had no idea when he did it, because it was a long time ago, why such a thing would have happened. And again, our understanding of what was behind it has gradually improved.
Yeah. Well, I think in World War II, you'd say they could have learned from if you showed any degree of sympathy and understanding to someone who said, I can't do this anymore, I suppose you were worried that everybody else would say, I can't do this anymore either. And you'd have, you know, you'd lose half your squadron, because most people, if they got a chance to walk away honorably, would do so, I expect.
I don't know. I mean, you know, it's, you know, and today there are many more women serving than, you know, than then. I mean, there were women's support groups in the war, but there were not very many women who were actually fighting in the front lines or flying into combat. There were women who ferried planes from one place to another and did other, but not a lot of women engaged in actual like aerial combat or bombing raids. I mean, and part of it too, if you really think about it, you know, women are not engineered very well physically for hours in a confined space. And so forth. And so, you know, it makes a lot of sense in many ways. Male plumbing system is way better designed for a lot of things than women's are. And to mix them together would be particularly difficult.
I was just reading, they just had the female Tour de France. And of course, one of the questions was, how do women go to the bathroom? You know, if they're riding for 6 hours, and apparently they just pull off beside the road and just stand up and pee, you know, and but the men can do it apparently as they're going along. They don't even have to stop. So, I mean, it must be horrible, but too much information, but I mean, that certainly would be true in a cockpit. You know, you're in that cockpit for 9-10 hours. What would you do?
Well, exactly. And if you really think about it, you know, the space missions when everybody is in a suit, you know, with filtration systems and so forth, it's much more possible to mix male and female members of a, you know, a trip up to the space station or longer voyage or something. But it would have been a lot more difficult in a bomber run over Germany or something. I mean,
those cockpits were tiny. They were just big enough so somebody could actually squeeze in. You know, there was no room to move around in any way. So
it's a wonderful story. And, you know, I've read all of Rhys's books or at least her adult fiction. I have not read your children's fiction, all of Rhys's books. And I love the fact that this one is a different kind of a heroine and a different kind of a story. And there are really so many World War II stories, but this one, while it is a World War II story, really is a coming of age story. It's for an adult, not for, you know, a youngster, but for an adult woman who, because her life is blown up and she doesn't have anyone to care for her, has to learn how to value herself and care for herself. I think it's a remarkable book, Rhys.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed writing about Josie. And somebody said, one of the interviews the other day, is she based on anyone? based on a family member or not. And I said, no, I had to think, what would you do? And then I suddenly said, it's interesting that you've said that, because it's never crossed my mind. But my great aunt, on my mother's side, my great aunt had to go into service when she was about 13, because she'd wanted to be a teacher, and she was going to stay on in school. And then her father was badly injured and couldn't work. And she was the oldest child still at home. And they said, someone has to get a job, and it's you. So they sent her into to be a maid in a big house, or it wasn't that big a house. It was a rich family of butchers. So they were not cultured. They were quite rich. And what I liked, one of the stories she told was she actually went on later to be a teacher and was very well read, but was that the daughter of the household came to her and she said, she was the same age as my aunt. She said, I'm going to call you Spinks, which was her last name. So my aunt looked at her and said, in that case, I'm going to call you Wadsworth. And so the girl looked rather shocked, and she said, but they do it at all the biggest houses. And my aunt said, then we'll wait till I get to one of the biggest houses, and walked away, which I loved, the fact that she was not going to be walked over. And I think Josie, the same quality has come out in Josie. So, maybe that was a little bit of channeling of my great aunt.
Well, that certainly could be. So we mentioned that there's a Lady Georgie book coming, November 1st.
Yes.
Will debut at the Poison Pen. But, I also meant to ask you, we're moving very slowly, thank goodness. We're moving very slowly towards the war. Have these wartime stories in a way prepared you for whether or not you're going to take Lady Georgie into the war? And if so, what will she do?
I've toyed with idea. The thing, I think that's why we're moving so slowly, is these stories, they might have the slightest of realistic undertones, but they're essentially funny. They're essentially light. And how do you chuckle when so many terrible things are going on? One thing I would like to do in the future, which I'm setting up, I think, is the fact that Mummy, her mother, is in Germany now, right. And she's going to marry this very, very rich German industrialist. Now, whether she will be stuck there in the future and someone will have to go and rescue her, that might be a fun story. We'll see. But then after that, how do you handle the war and keep it funny? That's going to be difficult. So we'll see. We're 1936, so let's take us very slowly through the next 4 years, and who knows?
I am not encouraging you. Trust me, I am not encouraging you to move Georgie's story past 1939. And the great thing about writing historical fiction is that you can literally start a new book the day after the last story ended. I mean, it's already history, so you can take forever to wander, up to. But I agree with you. I don't think the transition into the war, and I feel the same way about books that are written in the Edwardian era, and you can see World War I on the horizon, but everything is so different. I remember having that conversation with Tessa Arlen, who wrote I think 3, really, but she moves so fast to the war, and then none of those stories could work once you got to the war. Tasha Alexander and I had that same discussion, Lady Emily, she's got a long way to go, but those golden days of the are, I don't think those stories are going to transition with readers into the war.
No, because and into the war and after the war, because each time the world is so, after World War II, that's when the world really changed. I think when people came back from fighting and said, no, I'm not going to go into service. No, I'm not going to do this. No, I want respect to my own house and a decent job. And, that's when the big houses were all torn down because they couldn't get servants anymore.
Yeah, and you couldn't run them without a great deal of help. I remember how much my mother really loved the novels of Angela Thirkill. And the ones she wrote before the war were really fun. And the minute we got to the war, they turned pretty sour. And they were never the same. But life was not the same. It truly, it just took life and tore it up, and that was it.
Yep.
And the post-war period, I think, in Britain was a pretty grim time.
Oh, it was, because, I think everybody had struggled through the war and they felt, I've done my part, I've worked really hard. Now things should be better. And they weren't. I mean, the fact that we didn't come off rationing till 1953.
Right.
And the fact that everywhere you went, there'd be a bomb site where, there's still rubble on it, and that people were living in small prefabricated houses and expecting a better life. And I mean, my father used to say he ran a paper factory, and they had a sister factory in Germany that had been, because the owners were Jewish, had been closed during the war. And he went to reopen it after the war. And he said, the Americans came in with money and said, here, get all these new machines. And he said, my factory at home, I'm tying machines together with bits of string because you can't get the parts for them. So I think there was all that resentment in England after the war. It's a bleak period.
It is a bleak period. Absolutely true. Well, on that cheerful note, because actually this really is, bear in mind that Rhys at heart is in part a romance writer.
Yeah.
So this is not a bleak book. And you really have to root for Josie all the way through it. So Patrick or Jacob, whoever's doing this, come back and see if there are any questions or comments.
They ran away, you see.
Oh. No, it's Jacob. Hi, Jacob.
I'm going to be doing the Q&A for Patrick today.
Yeah.
So we do have a few questions. This one's from Martha. How do you decide who narrates your audiobook, Rhys?
Well, they send me several samples of people who they think might be good, and then I choose the one I liked. And in this case, I chose the one who I felt, got the Cockney accent right without sort of overdoing it. When I do a series like Lady Georgie, I have the same narrator. Molly Murphy, I have the same narrator each time. So, we've got those established, but I've been pleased. Each time they've sent me 3 or 4 samples, they've all been ones that I would be happy with. But and so, it's lucky that I do get to choose.
Very cool. Does your publisher have any say in that, on who narrates it?
Well, it's done with Audible. So Audible are the ones who choose the 4 people for me to have a listen to start with. The actual print publisher doesn't have any say in who does my audio edition.
Okay. This one is from Bruce. Hi, Rhys. Were there any surprises you came across when researching this novel, or anything that particularly fascinated you doing the research?
Well, I think the thing that fascinated me, doing all the research into Bomber Command and what they did, was how young they were. I mean, you always think of pilots as being these dashing men with the moustaches who are going on 30. And a lot of the pilots, they literally took at 18. And you think of a boy that age having to fly this enormous plane and then having to decide where to drop bombs. I mean, it's such a huge responsibility. And also survival rate was, I think, 50-something%. So that meant half of them were not going to live more than 6 months. And yet they got people signing up all the time. And that, that really blows you away when you think they kept coming back. People kept coming and saying, I'll do it now. Which, remarkable bravery.
Okay. This one is from Jean. My father was in the U.S. Navy scheduled for the invasion of Japan. And I think when he came home, he had PTSD, but it wasn't diagnosed. I wonder how Mike would be after this war, and how will the war have affected him?
It's a good question. I think anybody who's flown any sort of missions during the war, I know after the war they had a really tough time settling down because they were so used to a life in which suddenly the adrenaline was flowing completely. And then you went home and you slept, and then the adrenaline's flowing again. So they're used to that level of excitement, fear, whatever. And I know a lot of pilots after the war could not settle down to an ordinary job. Mike, I think, as we know, wants to start a small airline. Whether he will be able to do that and whether he will still fly and that will satisfy him, I don't know. But I think also bomber pilots did carry with them after the war a certain degree of guilt that they dropped bombs on innocent people. even though that's what they were told to do and that's what the other side were doing. It gradually hits you that they were people down there, and I dropped bombs on them. So I don't know. I hope he'll come through. We'll hope the best for him.
Well, let me add that the Vietnam War, for example, was a big recruitment field for commercial airlines. That many of the people who were trained to fly in Vietnam then, got jobs with American or United or, whatever it is, airlines have come and gone. And there wasn't a huge commercial airline industry at the end of World War II, but it grew pretty quickly thereafter.
Yeah.
So experienced pilots oftentimes had good job opportunities.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's it for the questions.
Any of your own?
No, I would have to read the book first, I think.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. For all of you,
Go and read the book, Jacob.
Right.
I will.
Jacob is our newest staff member at the Poison Pen, and I'm happy to say that he's going to be working with Patrick and with me, doing some of our author events, which is really fun because otherwise he's doing some jobs in the back room that aren't particularly fun. So I want to give him a chance to, do the literary side and see how much fun it is to talk to authors.
Yeah.
So Rhys, it's been as always a delight. I hope you enjoy your book passage conference. Give Tim Malini my very warmest
Yes,
regards.
I will. Yes, and I will see you at the end of October. I expect that's
We
when
will. Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who are Lady Georgie fans, right, November 1st at 7:00 down on your calendar. And I didn't ask you, what is your next standalone? Because you are so far ahead of the game. You must already have next year's standalone done.
It's written. It hasn't been through. My editor hasn't finished reading it yet. She's had sort of various setbacks this summer, including putting her mother into hospice. So she's a little bit behind, but the story is written. And again, part of it takes place in World War II, but it takes place in pre-war Paris. It takes place during the war, and it takes place after the war in Australia.
You do. I like the fact that you, of course, you yourself, we should mention, spent time in Australia. So I like the fact that some of your stories inevitably take people out of England to other parts of the Commonwealth, if not.
Yeah. No, I've been wanting to write about Australia for a long time because obviously it was a big part of my life, my parents lived there until they both passed away. My brother still lives there. So I used to go at least once a year down to visit even after I lived there. So there's just something about Australia that's very different, and you feel very remote from the rest of the world when you're there.
Well, there's a huge sort of Australian crime wave, as I have said for a while that I think Australia is going to replace Scandinavia as where a new wave of crime fiction is coming from. I'll be talking Monday night, in fact, with Haley Scrivener, who has a new book out, a debut out called. It has two different titles, and I'll confuse them. There's an American title and a British title, and they are different. I think one's called Dirt Road. I'd have to look it up. I'm sorry. But anyway, there's many of you saw the movie The Dry or read Jane Harper's book, The Dry. And, I think it's wonderful. I just got an email from a publisher who's very excited about a New Zealand author debut. So, I love it that we're coming in. So let me remind you, we still have autographed copies of Where the Sky Begins. We have the hardcover edition, we have the paperback edition. And if we run out, Rhys will sign them in October or November. Actually, October, you'll be back before then when she's back. So don't despair if we have temporarily run out. Thank you very much for joining us. Rhys, enjoy the rest of your on sale week.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
You bet. See you soon.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye.